Private Fujimoto was screaming, his uniform smoking from proximity to the flames. He stumbled backward, directly into Private Ishikawa, and both men went down in a tangle. The heat was already becoming unbearable, drawing moisture from Hiroshi's eyes and making each breath a labor. Sergeant Yamamoto pulled the pin from his grenade, holding the safety lever depressed. He looked at each man in turn, his eyes conveying what words could not. They had fought well. They had done their duty. Now it was time to embrace death with dignity rather than burn like animals. The ammunition began cooking off, individual rounds exploding in a chaotic string that sounded like firecracker celebrations during New Year festivals. But this was no celebration. This was the death rattle of their resistance. The final moments before individual soldiers became anonymous casualties in a war that had already killed millions and would kill millions more. Private Tanaka pulled his grenade pin, tears streaming down his soot-stained face. He was muttering something, probably his family's names, a final prayer that they would remember him not as he died, but as he lived. The boy had been brave. They had all been brave. But bravery meant nothing against napalm and Sherman tanks. The flames were spreading faster now, having found the wooden supports that reinforced part of the bunker's ceiling. Smoke was filling the space, thick and choking, making it impossible to see more than a few feet. Hiroshi fumbled for his own grenade, his last one, the one he had saved specifically for this moment. Private Kobayashi, the former schoolteacher, was already dead. A cooking round had struck him in the chest, a random tragedy in a bunker full of deliberate ones. His body lay crumpled in the corner where he had maintained his written logs, documents that would burn along with everything else, erasing the final record of their existence. Private Fujimoto had stopped screaming. The smoke had overcome him, or perhaps shock had simply shut his mind down to escape the horror. He lay unconscious near the spreading fire, which would reach him within seconds. At least he wouldn't feel it. That was something. A small mercy in a place devoid of mercy. Hiroshi pulled the pin from his grenade, feeling the safety lever spring away. The spoon clattered to the floor, lost in the chaos of flames and smoke and cooking ammunition. He had 4 seconds. 4 seconds to think about his life, his family, his sister Yuki, who would receive a letter informing her that her brother had died gloriously for the emperor. 3 seconds, he thought about his father's words about duty and fear. The old man had been right. Hiroshi had been terrified every moment since the invasion began, yet he had done his duty. He had manned his position, fired his weapon, killed enemy soldiers who were probably just as scared as he was. Did that make him brave? Did it matter? 2 seconds. He could see Sergeant Yamamoto through the smoke, the older man standing at attention despite the flames licking at his boots, despite the heat that was making his skin blister. The sergeant was showing them how to die. With dignity, with composure, like a warrior not a victim. 1 second. Hiroshi pressed the grenade against his chest, holding it there with both hands. The metal was cold against his skin. A final sensation of normalcy in a world that had become hell. He closed his eyes and thought of home, of rice fields and mountain streams and his mother's cooking. He thought of Yuki's laugh and his father's strong hands. He thought of everything he would never see again. The grenade exploded, and Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura ceased to exist. Outside the bunker, the American flamethrower tank held its position for another 30 seconds, pumping additional streams of napalm through the firing ports to ensure complete elimination of the position. The accompanying infantry remained in cover, weapons trained on the bunker and its escape tunnels, ready to shoot any defender who attempted to flee. None did. They never did anymore. The Americans had learned that Japanese soldiers in bunkers no longer tried to escape. They fought until they died or killed themselves. The flamethrower had proven so effective not just because of its destructive power, but because of its psychological impact. Faced with the choice between burning alive and self-destruction, Japanese defenders consistently chose the latter. When the flames finally died down and Marine infantry cautiously approached to clear the bunker, they found what they always found: charred bodies, some identifiable as human, others reduced to carbon sculptures in poses that suggested their final agonies. Unexploded grenades lay among the remains, having been dropped or fumbled in the chaos. The bunker's interior was coated with soot and melted material that had once been equipment, supplies and men. A young Marine corporal, barely 20 years old himself, stood at the bunker entrance and vomited. It was his first time clearing a position that had been hit with the flamethrower. His sergeant, a veteran of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, put a hand on his shoulder. "This is what it takes," the sergeant said quietly. "This is the only way to dig these poor bastards out of their holes. They won't surrender. They won't retreat. So we burn them, and we move on to the next bunker, and we do it again, and we keep doing it until this whole damn island is ours, or we're all dead." The corporal wiped his mouth and nodded. He understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. War had long since stopped being about glory or righteousness. It was about survival and mission completion.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The Japanese, in these bunkers, were trying to kill him and his fellow Marines. The flamethrower simply gave them the tools to kill the Japanese first. A graves registration team arrived to document the bunker's contents. They counted 7 bodies, though the condition of the remains made exact identification impossible. The team collected dog tags when they could find them, along with any personal effects that had survived the fire. These would be catalogued, stored, and eventually returned to families if Japan ever surrendered. Most likely, the items would remain in storage indefinitely, physical reminders of men who had been transformed into ash and memory. The Marines moved on. There were dozens more bunkers to clear, hundreds more Japanese defenders to kill or drive to suicide. The island was only 8 square miles, but every square foot was contested by an enemy who had been taught that surrender was worse than death. The campaign would continue for another 3 weeks, consuming American lives at a rate that horrified commanders and politicians back home. For the 7 men who died in that bunker on that February afternoon, the war was over. Their deaths would not be individually recorded in American casualty reports. They would become statistics, part of the estimated 18,000 Japanese defenders killed during the battle for Iwo Jima. Their names would not appear in American newspapers or history books. They were simply the enemy, obstacles to be eliminated through the application of superior firepower. But they had been men. They had had families and dreams and fears like any other soldiers in any other war. Hiroshi Nakamura had loved his sister and respected his father. Sergeant Yamamoto had survived previous battles and probably thought he might survive another. Corporal Sato had been extraordinarily skilled with a machine gun, talents he had developed through practice and dedication. Each man had been an individual with a full life behind him and a future ahead that would never come. The flamethrower had taken approximately 90 seconds to completely eliminate their bunker from combat effectiveness. 90 seconds from the first gout of flame to the final grenade explosion. 90 seconds to transform 7 living humans into casualties of war. The efficiency was remarkable. The cost in human terms was incalculable. 300 meters away, in another bunker on the same defensive line, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada had watched the entire sequence through his binoculars. He had seen the flamethrower tank approach. He had seen Sergeant Yamamoto's bunker open fire. He had watched the napalm stream into the firing ports. He had heard the ammunition cooking off and the grenades exploding as the defenders chose their own deaths. Now he lowered his binoculars and looked at the 6 men under his command in this bunker. They were watching him, waiting for orders, waiting for leadership, waiting for him to tell them how they would respond when the flamethrower tank inevitably approached their position next. Lieutenant Yamada had no answer. He had no plan that would save them. He had no brilliant tactical innovation that would defeat American tanks and flamethrowers with the limited resources available to his squad. All he had was the same choice that Hiroshi Nakamura and his comrades had faced. Fight until the flames came, then die by their own hands rather than burn alive. The Americans were already moving. The flamethrower tank was pivoting, searching for the next target. Infantry were spreading out, preparing for another assault on another bunker. The process would repeat. It would repeat dozens of times across this volcanic hellscape until every Japanese defender was dead and the Americans could plant their flag on Mount Suribachi. Lieutenant Yamada pulled his pistol from its holster and checked the magazine. 7 rounds, 1 for each of his men and 1 for himself. If it came to that. He hoped it wouldn't. He hoped some miracle would occur, some divine intervention that would change the mathematics of their situation. But hope had died weeks ago when the American fleet appeared on the horizon and began its bombardment. All that remained was duty and death, and the determination to make both meaningful. The liberation of Iwo Jima came 36 days after the invasion began. When American forces finally secured the island, they found over 11 miles of tunnels and hundreds of bunkers, most filled with the remains of defenders who had chosen death over capture. The identification process proved nearly impossible. Bodies were often burned beyond recognition or had been buried in tunnel collapses. Most families received letters stating only that their sons or husbands had died honorably defending the empire. Hiroshi's family learned of his death in April 1945 through a terse military telegram. His father received the news without visible emotion, bowing to the messenger and thanking him for delivering word of his son's glorious sacrifice. Only later, alone in the rice fields, did the old man allow himself to weep. His sister Yuki refused to believe it at first, insisting there must be some mistake, that her brother would surely return home when the war ended. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers who witnessed the flamethrower attacks was profound and lasting. Lieutenant Yamada survived the battle by retreating deeper into the tunnel system as American forces overran his position. He surrendered in March 1945, one of fewer than 200 Japanese prisoners taken alive from the entire garrison. The shame of survival haunted him for decades. American forces who operated the flamethrower tanks suffered their own psychological wounds. Many crew members developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder plagued by nightmares of burning men and the smell of cooking flesh. Several sought psychiatric treatment after returning home, though the military medical establishment of 1945 had little understanding of combat trauma. The tactic proved devastatingly effective across the Pacific theater. Flamethrower tanks were subsequently used in Okinawa and planned for the invasion of mainland Japan. When atomic bombs ended the war in August 1945, plans existed to deploy hundreds of these vehicles against Japanese home island defenses. The projected casualties from such an invasion, both American and Japanese, numbered in the millions. The few Japanese veterans who survived bunker warfare and lived to old age rarely spoke of their experiences. The shame associated with surrender or survival ran too deep. Most took their memories to the grave, leaving gaps in the historical record that can never be filled. Their families learned to avoid asking questions, sensing the pain that any discussion of the war would unleash. Medical research conducted decades later on Pacific War veterans revealed lasting physiological changes from extreme combat stress. Survivors showed elevated cortisol levels, hyperactive startle responses, and chronic anxiety disorders. The trauma had literally rewired their nervous systems, leaving permanent scars invisible to the eye but devastating in their impact on daily life. The children of these survivors inherited more than just family stories. Emerging research into epigenetics suggests that extreme trauma can alter gene expression in ways that pass to subsequent generations. The descendants of men who faced flamethrower attacks or witnessed their comrades burn alive may carry biological markers of that trauma, manifesting as anxiety disorders, depression, or stress responses disproportionate to their own life experiences. The bunker where Hiroshi died remained sealed for decades after the war. American forces filled many defensive positions with explosives or bulldozed them shut to prevent accidents. When archaeological teams finally excavated the site in the 1990s as part of a joint Japanese-American historical project, they found skeletal remains, corroded weapons, and personal effects that had somehow survived the fire. Among these items was a small photograph, badly charred, showing a young woman who might have been Yuki. The photograph was returned to Japan and eventually traced to Hiroshi's family through military records. Yuki, now an elderly woman, held the damaged image of her younger self and wept for the brother she had lost 50 years earlier. She had married, raised children, and lived a full life, but part of her had remained frozen on that day, in April 1945, when the telegram arrived. The strategic value of Iwo Jima, the objective for which Hiroshi and 18,000 other Japanese defenders died, proved debatable. American planners had justified the invasion by arguing the island would provide emergency landing fields for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan. Approximately 2,400 B-29s made emergency landings on Iwo Jima during the final months of the war, potentially saving 24,000 American aircrew lives. Whether this justified the 6,800 American deaths and 19,000 wounded required to capture the island remained a subject of historical controversy. For Hiroshi's family, such strategic calculations meant nothing. Their son and brother had died far from home, defending an island he had never heard of before being sent there. The cause for which he fought ultimately failed when Japan surrendered in August 1945. His sacrifice, viewed through the lens of history, accomplished nothing beyond adding one more name to the casualty lists of a war that killed tens of millions. The flamethrower tanks that killed Hiroshi and his comrades were eventually retired from service, replaced by more sophisticated weapons systems. Several were preserved in military museums, static displays that visitors could examine without understanding the terror these machines had inspired. Plaques described their technical specifications and tactical employment, clinical language that sanitized the reality of men burning alive in concrete bunkers. Veterans organizations in both Japan and America gradually began acknowledging the shared humanity of former enemies. Former Marines who had fought on Iwo Jima participated in joint memorial ceremonies with Japanese veterans, standing together at the island cemeteries to honor all who died there. These reconciliations came too late for most participants, occurring decades after the war, when most veterans were elderly or deceased. Modern Japanese society struggles with how to remember the Pacific War. The aggressive militarism that led to conflict with America and other nations is now widely condemned, yet the individual soldiers who fought and died are honored for their sacrifice and devotion to duty. This creates a complex narrative where the war itself was wrong, but the warriors were honorable. Hiroshi exists in this ambiguous space, neither hero nor villain, simply a young man who did what his nation demanded and paid with his life. American perspectives on the Pacific War have evolved similarly. The use of flamethrowers, firebombing of cities, and atomic weapons are now debated as potential war crimes, even as the soldiers who employed these tactics are honored as heroes who did what was necessary to end the war. The moral complexity defies simple narratives of good versus evil, forcing recognition that war brutalizes everyone it touches, regardless of which side claims victory. The bunker warfare tactics employed by Japanese forces on Iwo Jima influenced military thinking for decades afterward. American experiences there informed tunnel warfare doctrine used in Vietnam and counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The lessons learned from burning Japanese defenders out of fortified positions were applied to new conflicts, perpetuating cycles of violence that echoed across generations. The families of the 7 men who died in that bunker on that February afternoon in 1945 gradually lost touch with each other. Without their shared connection to the deceased, the relationships faded. Yuki never met the families of her brother's final comrades, never heard the stories of who these men were or how they lived their last moments. Each family grieved in isolation, creating separate memories of men who died together. The economic consequences of losing an entire generation of young men rippled through Japanese society for decades. Villages like Hiroshi's lost their strongest workers, creating labor shortages that affected agricultural production. The demographic imbalance contributed to economic difficulties during the immediate post-war period, though Japan's subsequent recovery obscured these early struggles. Educational curricula in both nations eventually incorporated lessons about the Pacific War, though perspectives differed significantly. American textbooks emphasized the necessity of defeating Japanese aggression and saving lives through use of atomic weapons. Japanese textbooks focused on the suffering of the Japanese people and the importance of peace. Neither version fully captured the experiences of men like Hiroshi, trapped in bunkers and facing impossible choices. The psychological preparation that Japanese soldiers received, emphasizing death before surrender, created the conditions that made flamethrower tactics necessary. Had Japanese military culture permitted surrender when positions became untenable, the mass immolation of bunker defenders might have been avoided. Instead, ideology on both sides created a self-reinforcing cycle of brutality that maximized casualties and suffering. The rare accounts from Japanese survivors who witnessed flamethrower attacks describe a level of terror that transcended normal combat fear. The sound of the weapon firing, the sight of napalm streaming toward defensive positions, and the screams of men burning alive created trauma that persisted for lifetimes. These survivors often refused to discuss their experiences, carrying their memories in silence until death. Modern military ethics training uses cases like the flamethrower attacks to explore questions about proportionality and necessity in warfare. Were such tactics justified by the military necessity of eliminating fortified positions? Did the psychological impact on both attackers and defenders constitute unnecessary cruelty? These debates continue without resolution, highlighting the fundamental moral ambiguities of war. The technological legacy of the flamethrower tactics used on Iwo Jima lives on in modern thermobaric weapons and advanced incendiary systems. Military forces worldwide continue developing weapons designed to defeat fortified positions by creating extreme heat and pressure. The principles that killed Hiroshi Nakamura remain relevant in contemporary warfare, refined by 8 decades of technological advancement. Memorial services held annually at Iwo Jima draw participants from both nations, creating moments of shared grief and attempted reconciliation. These ceremonies acknowledge that young men on both sides were victims of decisions made by political and military leaders far from the battlefield. Hiroshi's name appears on memorial walls alongside thousands of others, each representing an individual life cut short. The historical record of the battle contains countless stories like Hiroshi's that will never be fully told. Most defenders left no written accounts, no personal testimonies, no detailed records of their final hours. They vanished into history as statistics, their individual experiences known only to those who died alongside them. The 7 men in that bunker took their complete story to their graves. Contemporary Japan's pacifist constitution and rejection of militarism emerged partly from recognition of the catastrophic costs of the Pacific War. The memory of young men like Hiroshi dying in bunkers far from home influenced post-war Japanese society's determination to avoid future conflicts. His death, and the deaths of millions like him, created a generation committed to ensuring such sacrifices would never be required again. The families who lost sons and brothers to the bunker warfare of Iwo Jima carried grief that shaped their remaining years. Hiroshi's mother never recovered from losing her eldest child, maintaining a shrine in their home where she placed daily offerings until her own death in 1963. His father became withdrawn, working his rice fields in silence, rarely speaking of the son who would never return to help with harvests. The archaeological evidence recovered from bunkers like Hiroshi's provided material confirmation of written accounts describing the final moments of defenders. Researchers found evidence of self-inflicted wounds, confirming that many soldiers chose suicide over burning alive. The physical remains told stories of desperate final moments that official histories often sanitized or omitted. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. February 1945. Iwo Jima. Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura pressed his back against the volcanic rock wall of his bunker, feeling the tremors through the earth before he heard the sound. The American tanks were coming. He had 60 seconds, maybe less, before the world would turn to fire. Through the narrow firing slit, he watched the metal beast approach, its long barrel protruding like the tongue of some mechanical dragon. The other men in the bunker, 7 souls who had become his brothers over 18 months of island warfare, stopped their whispered prayers. They knew what that particular gun meant. They had seen what it did to Bunker 17 yesterday. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The screaming had lasted 4 minutes before the ammunition inside cooked off and silenced everything forever. Hiroshi had been 21 years old when he arrived on this miserable volcanic rock in June 1944. The Imperial Japanese Army had told him and 15,000 other soldiers that they were the final shield protecting the homeland from American invasion. The island was only 8 square miles, barely larger than his family's farming village in Hokkaido, yet it had been transformed into the most heavily fortified piece of earth in the Pacific theater. The Americans called it Iwo Jima. To Hiroshi and his fellow defenders, it was simply hell's anteroom, a place where men were buried alive in tunnels and bunkers, emerging only to kill or die. The island's commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had implemented a defense strategy unlike anything the Japanese military had attempted before. There would be no suicidal banzai charges, no glorious deaths on the beaches. Instead, they would become moles, burrowing deep into the volcanic rock, creating an underground fortress that would bleed the Americans for every inch of this worthless island. For 8 months, Hiroshi had helped dig. They excavated 11 miles of tunnels using hand tools, explosives, and sheer determination fueled by rice rations that grew smaller each week. The volcanic rock fought them at every turn, crumbling unexpectedly, or proving harder than steel. Men died in cave-ins. Others succumbed to the heat and sulfur fumes that leaked from the earth itself, as if the island were determined to kill its defenders before the Americans ever arrived. The bunker complex, where Hiroshi now waited, had taken 3 months to complete. It sat on the second defensive line, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire with 5 other bunkers. The main chamber measured roughly 4 meters by 3 meters, with walls of reinforced concrete 2 meters thick. 3 firing ports faced the likely American approach routes. 2 escape tunnels led to adjacent defensive positions, though Hiroshi suspected these exits would become tombs once the Americans discovered them. Inside this concrete coffin, 7 men had lived for the past 3 weeks since the American. Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto commanded their position, a veteran of the China campaign whose face bore shrapnel scars from the Battle of Shanghai. Corporal Takeshi Seto served as their machine gunner, a former factory worker from Osaka, who could field strip and reassemble their Type 92 heavy machine gun in complete darkness. Private Daichi Fujimoto manned the second firing port with his Arisaka rifle, a fisherman's son from Okinawa, whose eyes could spot movement at incredible distances. Private Ichiro Tanaka, barely 19 years old, served as their ammunition carrier and messenger. His youth made him the fastest runner, capable of sprinting through the tunnel networks to carry reports and retrieve supplies. Private Masaru Kobayashi, the oldest at 36, had been a school teacher in civilian life. He maintained their written logs and composed the final letters that would never be sent. Private Yuki Ishikawa, a carpenter's apprentice from Kyoto, used his skills to shore up tunnel collapses and improve their fighting positions. And then there was Hiroshi, designated as the bunker's grenadier and secondary rifleman. His role was to throw grenades at approaching infantry and engage targets of opportunity with his rifle. In practice, this meant he spent most of his time staring through the firing slit, watching Americans die and waiting for his turn. The American invasion had commenced on February 19, with a naval bombardment that defied comprehension. For 3 days prior, American warships had pounded the island with shells so large their explosions created craters 20 feet deep. Hiroshi had huddled in the tunnels as the earth shook like a living thing trying to throw them off. Dust and rock fragments filled the air until breathing became an act of will. Several tunnels collapsed, entombing their defenders in darkness and stone. When the bombardment finally ceased, and the first wave of Marines hit the beaches, Hiroshi had felt a strange relief. At least now they could fight back. The orders from General Kuribayashi were explicit: let them land, let them advance inland, then destroy them from prepared positions they cannot see or easily assault. Do not waste lives in glorious charges, make them pay for every meter with American blood. For 3 weeks, this strategy had worked with horrific effectiveness. The Americans advanced, but slowly, losing men to hidden bunkers that would erupt with machine gun fire, then fall silent before return fire could be effectively directed. Japanese soldiers would retreat through the tunnels, pop up in different positions, fire again and disappear. The volcanic rock and concrete made the bunkers nearly impervious to standard artillery and tank fire. But the Americans adapted. They always adapted. That was the terrifying thing about fighting them. They had resources and ingenuity that the Japanese military could never match. When conventional weapons failed to dislodge bunker defenders, they brought up flamethrower tanks. Hiroshi had first seen these machines 4 days ago. The M4 Sherman tank, with its standard 75 MBAR gun, had been modified with a large cylindrical apparatus mounted where the hull machine gun used to be. From this protruded a nozzle that could project burning napalm gel over a distance of nearly 100 meters. The effective range against bunker positions was closer to 40 meters, but that was more than sufficient. The tactics were brutally simple. American infantry would pin down a bunker with rifle and machine gun fire, preventing the defenders from engaging effectively. Then the flamethrower tank would advance, accompanied by several standard Shermans that would engage any anti-tank positions that revealed themselves. Once in range, the flamethrower would direct its stream of liquid fire at the bunker entrance or firing ports. What happened next varied, depending on the bunker's construction and the defender's choices. Sometimes the fire would simply cook everyone inside, raising temperatures to levels that boiled blood and melted flesh. Other times, the flames would ignite ammunition stores, causing catastrophic explosions. Occasionally, defenders would flee through escape tunnels, only to be shot down by waiting infantry or killed by Marines who had learned to position themselves at likely exit points. The worst scenario, which Hiroshi had witnessed from his position, was when defenders panicked and ran directly out of the bunker into the flames. He had watched men transform into living torches, stumbling blindly for several seconds before collapsing. The smell had carried on the wind, a sickening mixture of burning fuel, cooking meat, and something else he couldn't identify but would never forget. Bunker 17 had been commanded by Lieutenant Hideo Matsuda, a friend from Hiroshi's training company. They had shared sake before the invasion, talking about their families and making promises to visit each other's homes after the war. Hiroshi had been watching when the flamethrower tank approached Matsuda's position. He had seen the first gout of fire lance through the bunker's firing port. What followed haunted him during the brief periods when exhaustion allowed him to sleep. The flames had found the ammunition storage area within seconds. The explosion that followed had been powerful enough to collapse part of the bunker's roof. But it hadn't killed everyone instantly. For 4 agonizing minutes, Hiroshi had listened to the screaming over the sound of small arms ammunition cooking off in a staccato rhythm. Then silence. Blessed and terrible. Now, as Hiroshi watched another flamethrower tank lumber toward his position, he understood this would be his last day. The mathematics of their situation allowed no other conclusion. They had perhaps 100 rounds remaining for the machine gun. Rifle ammunition was more plentiful, but largely useless against armored vehicles. They had 6 grenades, effective only if Americans approached close enough to throw them, which their tactics specifically prevented. Sergeant Yamamoto had already given the order. They would fight until the flames came, then use their last grenades on themselves. It was the only way to avoid burning alive or being captured. The sergeant had been explicit about what happened to captured Japanese soldiers. The Americans would interrogate them for information about the tunnel systems, defensive positions, and remaining troop strength. Then they would be shipped to prisoner of war camps in America, where they would spend years in shame, having failed their emperor and their families. Death was preferable. Death was expected. The military code of Bushido demanded it. Yet as Hiroshi checked his rifle and arranged his grenades within easy reach, he found himself thinking about his younger sister Yuki. She was 16 now, probably helping their mother with the spring planting back home. Did she know he was here? Did she understand that her brother was about to die defending an island she had never heard of, an island that grew nothing but sulfur and death? The tank was 300 meters away now, advancing slowly, its accompanying infantry spread out in tactical formations that spoke to hard-won experience. These were not the green troops who had landed 3 weeks ago. These were Marines who had learned their lessons in American blood, who now moved with the careful precision of men who understood the cost of mistakes. Corporal Sato traversed the machine gun slightly, tracking the tank's approach. He wouldn't fire yet. Revealing their position prematurely would only draw artillery or airstrikes that even their fortified bunker might not survive. The key was to wait until the Americans committed infantry forward, then open fire and inflict maximum casualties before the inevitable end came. 250 meters. Hiroshi could see individual Marines now, their green uniforms stark against the black volcanic sand. They moved in pairs, one man advancing while his partner provided covering fire positions. Their rifles were always pointed toward likely threat areas. These men were professionals who had been forged in the crucible of island warfare across the Pacific. Private Fujimoto shifted nervously at his firing port, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard of his Arisaka rifle. He was muttering something under his breath. Either a prayer or a curse, perhaps both. The fisherman's son had been reliable throughout the campaign, never panicking even when American naval shells had collapsed the tunnel section next to their position, killing 12 men in an instant. 200 meters. The flamethrower tank paused, its commander probably scanning for threats through his vision ports. 2 standard Sherman tanks flanked it, their 75 mm guns loaded with high-explosive shells capable of destroying any anti-tank position foolish enough to reveal itself. The Americans had learned to never send flamethrower tanks forward without heavy support. Sergeant Yamamoto made a small gesture signaling everyone to absolute stillness. The slightest movement visible through their firing ports could draw attention. They had to become part of the rock, invisible until the moment came to strike. Then they would make their deaths meaningful by taking as many Americans with them as possible. 150 meters. The infantry were spreading out more, creating wider intervals between men to prevent machine gun fire from hitting multiple targets. They were preparing for the final advance, the dangerous moment when they would close on the bunker to allow the flamethrower its deadly work. Private Tanaka, the youngest, was crying silently. Tears streamed down his face, but he made no sound. His hands remained steady on his rifle, his eyes fixed on his assigned firing arc. Hiroshi felt a surge of pride in the boy. He would die well. They all would. 100 meters. The flamethrower tank's engine note changed as the driver shifted gears for the final approach. The sound was distinctive, a mechanical growl that signaled the beginning of the end. Hiroshi's hands were sweating despite the cool air in the bunker. He wiped them on his uniform trousers, ensuring his grip on the rifle would be secure. 75 meters. The Marines were going to ground now, finding whatever cover the volcanic landscape offered. They would wait there while the tank did its work, then advance to ensure no defenders escaped or survived. It was efficient. It was effective. It had worked dozens of times across this cursed island. Sergeant Yamamoto's hand rose slowly, silently. Every man in the bunker understood what came next. They had drilled this moment, discussed it during the endless hours waiting in their concrete tomb. When the sergeant's hand dropped, Corporal Sato would open fire with the machine gun, aiming not for the impossible task of penetrating the tank's armor, but for the exposed infantry. The rest would engage with rifles, throwing grenades if any targets came close enough. 50 meters. The flamethrower tank's turret was traversing slowly, searching for their firing ports. Once it identified them, the Nabum would come. They had perhaps 30 seconds to inflict casualties before the flames arrived. 30 seconds to justify their existence, to make their deaths matter in some microscopic way in this vast and terrible war. Hiroshi thought about his father, a rice farmer who had fought in the Russo-Japanese War 40 years earlier. The old man had rarely spoken of his experiences, but Hiroshi remembered one conversation, late at night, when his father had drunk too much sake. "War is not about glory," his father had said. "War is about doing your duty while everything inside you screams to run away. The brave man and the coward feel the same fear. The only difference is what they do with it." 40 meters. The tank commander's hatch was open, a small detail that Hiroshi's mind catalogued automatically. The American officer inside was probably coordinating with his infantry, ensuring everyone was ready for the final assault. He would button up the hatch before firing the flamethrower, protecting himself from any desperate last shots from the bunker's defenders. 30 meters. Sergeant Yamamoto's hand remained raised, steady as stone. The machine gun's barrel protruded slightly from its firing port, aimed at a cluster of Marines who had gone to ground behind a small rise. The first burst would probably kill 3 of them before they could react. Perhaps 4 if Corporal Sato's aim was true. 25 meters. Private Ishikawa was praying audibly now, a Buddhist chant that spoke of rebirth and enlightenment. The carpenter's apprentice had always been the most devout among them, maintaining a small shrine in the corner of the bunker where he left offerings of rice and water. Hiroshi wondered if Buddha really existed, if there really was some cosmic justice that would balance the scales of this meaningless slaughter. 20 meters. The flamethrower's nozzle was clearly visible now, a blunt snout that promised agony. Hiroshi had heard that napalm was based on jellied gasoline, sticky enough to adhere to skin and concrete, hot enough to melt steel. The Americans had developed it specifically to counter Japanese fortifications. It was ingenious in its horror. 15 meters. The tank was slowing, coming to the optimal firing position. This was the moment. This was when they would either die fighting or die without resistance. There was no other choice, no miraculous escape, no last-minute reprieve, just duty and death and the hope that their sacrifice would buy a few more hours for other defenders elsewhere on this island. Sergeant Yamamoto's hand dropped. Corporal Sato opened fire, the heavy machine gun's distinctive chatter filling the bunker with sound and fury. Through his firing port, Hiroshi saw tracer rounds arc across the black sand, finding targets among the Marines who had thought themselves safe. Men fell, torn apart by the large-caliber bullets. Others dove for deeper cover, returning fire blindly toward the bunker. Hiroshi acquired a target, a Marine who had risen to throw a grenade. He led the moving figure slightly, just as his marksmanship instructors had taught him years ago, and squeezed the trigger. The Arasaka's recoil was familiar, almost comforting. The Marine stumbled and fell. Whether Hiroshi's bullet had hit him or if he had simply tripped was impossible to determine. The return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Rifle bullets sparked off the bunker's concrete face. A grenade exploded short, showering the structure with rock fragments. The Americans knew where they were now. Everything that followed would be inevitable. The flamethrower tank lurched forward the final 10 meters. Through his firing port, Hiroshi watched the nozzle elevate slightly, tracking toward their position. He had time to fire one more shot, chambering a new round with practiced speed. His target was the tank commander, visible for just a moment longer before he would close his hatch. The shot went wide. Hiroshi had rushed it, let fear overcome training. The tank commander disappeared inside, securing the hatch with a metallic clang that Hiroshi heard even over the machine gun fire. That was it. No more chances. No more time. Corporal Sato was still firing, traversing the machine gun in short bursts, each one accounting for another American casualty. The man was magnificent, a warrior in his final moments, making every bullet count. Then a heavy machine gun from the American position found their firing port. Bullets chewed through the opening, ricocheting inside the bunker with deadly unpredictability. One struck Corporal Sato in the throat, nearly decapitating him. He slumped over his weapon, blood spraying across Private Fujimoto, who screamed and recoiled from his own firing port. The machine gun fell silent. Their primary weapon was gone. They were down to rifles and grenades against tanks and flamethrowers. The flamethrower's nozzle steadied, aimed directly at their central firing port where Sato's body now blocked the machine gun. Hiroshi understood what would happen in the next few seconds. The napalm would stream through that opening, filling their bunker with liquid fire that would stick to everything it touched. The temperature would spike to over 1,000 degrees. The air itself would become poison, searing lungs with each breath. Sergeant Yamamoto was already moving, retrieving 2 grenades from their storage position. He handed one to Private Tanaka, who accepted it with shaking hands. The sergeant's face was calm, resigned, almost peaceful. He had been preparing for this moment since they landed on this island. Perhaps since he joined the army years ago. Every Japanese soldier knew how their story would end. The flamethrower fired. The sound was distinctive, a whooshing roar that seemed to suck all other noise from the world. Through his firing port, Hiroshi saw the gout of flame lance out from the tank, a stream of burning gel that moved like a living thing, serpentine and hungry. It struck their bunker's face just beside the central firing port, napalm splashing across the concrete and flowing into the opening where Corporal Sato's body lay. The machine gunner's corpse ignited instantly, becoming a pyre that filled the bunker with light and heat and the smell of burning flesh. Flames began pouring through the firing port, a waterfall of fire that pooled on the bunker floor and began spreading toward the ammunition stored along the wall.